On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at Cal IT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. Okay, so we are good to go. Yes, good to go. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Our speakers, our shrinking audience, need of a coffee and a nap as well.
Not in that order.
Not
Because that doesn't work.
So I wanted to, take. There's been like any good conference, the best things going on are sort of outside any kind of program. They're off on the side in these kinds of conversations, sort of a little bit here as well. So I wanted to really sort of do two things: one more programmatic and one more tactical in that. Programmatic, as I said, this is in many ways a kind of launch event for the Center for Design and Geopolitics, a think tank in the Peter sense of it. I get in a way we are being the guys who make tanks. It's being San Diego, and so the question I want to sort of put on the table once again is these terms of design. Obviously, in its own way, is a kind of overused concept, if also an underused capacity. The geo as a prefix to nominate what is in fact the site condition to which design would put its attention, and the political, the polis, this domain from the polis, as the is sort of both the methodology but also what's at stake for the construction of this around these, perhaps also these three ideas of emergent governance, not a global governance, but emergent governance, and computational jurisdictions and the public ecologies, which we've dealt with in a number of different kinds of ways. So towards the goal of further specifying the program, what comes next, and the rest of this as well, I wanted to give our August participants an opportunity to both rehearse and re-engage some of those side conversations that's been going on, and to ask them again to their thoughts and reaction of what's come together and what's come apart with there as well. And we'll sort of keep it open and informal in that way as well. So let me just open the floor to our panels there as well. I think, Ed, perhaps I'll start with you. I know you had something you wanted to sort of say. We'll just go from there and we'll just keep it. And then, of course, we'll have the audience go.
I'm going to be really quick. I think one of the issues that comes up when you're talking about design is particularly the question of time and how designers think time and position their thinking and their acting in time and models of time, the different kind of models of time that they work with. A couple of issues came to mind. Peter was talking about the necessity to elicit a geoimaginary consciousness, and the presentation that you made was really interesting, almost hyperfictional, bouncing back and forth between real expeditions and imagined expeditions. And that reminded me of an issue that came up during Mackenzie's talk yesterday, and the panel too, I think that you were on, that came up again today in the panel that I was on, which had to do with the shifting status of the real and what the value of thinking design across different timescales was, but also the value of thinking design in relationship to a presumed real, and the necessity to question the sort of datum line of the real, not to deny that reality is there, but to point out that there are many shifting constructs of reality that allow us to imagine a possible future, that allow us to elicit a different kind of geoimaginary consciousness, as Peter was putting it. So to me, that seemed like a really important set of themes to tie together. And also, when I'm talking about thinking time in different ways, I just want to be very clear that I'm invoking the kind of inability humans have to think outside their own immediate time frames. This is something that came up during a number of talks this morning, Larry's talk, the problem of thinking outside, and others, the problem of thinking outside the sort of 6,000 to 8,000 year frame, back through hundreds of thousands of years to understand these kinds of cycles and the illusion of stability that we're probably at the end of. So that's one issue in terms of design thinking and time. But the other is to look at systems and understand that systems are penetrated by multiple scales of repetition. And each one of those kinds of repetition or stability or change is a time frame. Some of them are very, very rapid, and some of them are very, very, very long. And each of them has a kind of a life unto itself, many of which we're unable to perceive. So design thinking, I feel, is increasingly acknowledging those different kinds of regimes of time and trying to integrate design thinking and those regimes of time. And it seems to me that that was a huge and explicit theme of the conference that I was extremely excited about. But I want to go back to that eliciting of an imaginary, because to me it's not just a fantasy, it's literally opening up the possible and allowing us to think other alternative realities that Peter and Mackenzie were talking about. Also, I really want to get behind the idea of the gesture on many different scales. I appreciated the connection. The kind of gesture I was trying to invoke was particularly not just the human gesture, but the idea that a landscape could have a gesture. The idea that systems which are much larger and much smaller than the human can have gestures, and they're not just physical movements. That was something I really appreciated in Ricardo's presentation as well. And it's connected back to the evoking of this imaginary that I think we need.
Well, one of the elements of thinking time in terms of design is to, at least in the 80s, we imagined it as a kind of fractalization, to use the language at that moment. And in fractalization, our sense was that the scales of contestational design had to understand the durational rhythms within each of the iterations. That is, a certain type of gesture would have to understand that within that durational time scale, inertia might be the contestational product that is required of that design gesture, as opposed to in another, a kind of hyper speed would be necessary to create the gesture. So in contestational design, at least we imagined that we had to understand the scales of that time. Of course, it was embedded within a certain space of the political moment, as opposed to kind of the scales of primal beginnings of time to the end of time. So it's that particular scale wasn't really a condition of the design of the work. Although recently in conversations with Micah and others around the question of trans in transborder, transdisciplinary, this notion of trans, to use Bordeaux's set, infinities. That is that we also have to begin to imagine that it's not just the domain of a certain duration, but these scales of parallel infinities that are occurring. And so the geoaesthetic then in contestational design would be, to what degree do transborder bodies shift those scales, and how do they accomplish it? I'm not sure, but we can imagine and rehearse the politics of that. We can imagine and rehearse how engineering of the oppressed might shift those scales along the way. And one of the things that I failed to mention in my presentation was that just this week, Mexico has ended the border between itself and Guatemala. So that the transborder bodies have now, just because of their sheer weight, forced a rebalancing of that border. So now Mexico is offering humanitarian visas, which give the immigrants access to education, health, and also one of their core issues is to dismantle the inadequate and really unsavory military police force that was either symbolically raping the community, really raping the community, and raiding the economies of that community. Now, whether this geo-design, will it work or not, I don't know. But again, you know, it's still a minimal scale as opposed to the larger scale of time that you're speaking about. But I do think we have to think about inertia and hyperinertia in those moments of mobility.
Well, since talking about time, since our time of this discussion is limited, I would like to make some remarks in regards to very practically what kind of thing which would be really important, which advantage of a unique situation of KLT2, its art programs. It's not working.
We need better batteries.
Yes. Yeah, just thinking about some kind of practical strategies which the center can adopt, which would take advantage of its connections to extraordinary range of people. Some of them are here, right? The uniqueness of CSD, for example, it's visual arts and arts programs, right? 6 college, and also the unique KLT2. And what I want to say is this. So I think I kind of, after working, having more close interactions with computer scientists, engineers through KLT2, I came to a conclusion that these people are brilliant, but ultimately with the sciences, especially like the sciences of artificial, are conservative in the sense that the scientists, or especially engineers, operate within the common sense of contemporary society. Right? So you have amazing tens of thousands of people science on search engines or on how to help people organize their photographs better, right? Now we operate within existing categories put by consumer industries, media industries, and so on, right? So, and when you have exhibitions such as at MoMA, Rising Currents, where you have artists and designers, who don't know about PCA, right? Who don't know about matrix algebra, but who have kind of capacity or who have ability or who can get credit for imagining crazy things. And the problem, of course, how do you put it together, right? So how do you create projects where you bring this ability to imagine crazy things, but then calculate, right, up to 1 bit and 1 pixel how to build it? And I know that this is something Larry has been probably working on, right, all his life, and I know that we can't solve this in general, but maybe we can do something here. And I think there's a particular problem we have to address, right? That when we artists, humanities people come to computer science engineers, sometimes we want to work with us. But the problem is not the money, right? The problem is not that, we offer them really little money. The problem is that we say we have to publish in our computer science engineering papers. So, and I said, guys, you can spend half an hour of your time and we can get like some publication in Humanities and Media Journal and they like kind of bewildered, right? So how do we figure a mechanism to create these collaborations where scientists feel we're going to get some support, that we're going to put their time and the time of our PhD students and master students? If we can figure it out, we can create a new kind of realistic futurism in this place, right? Which I think before was only enabled by a few people like Fuller, right? By very particular individuals who had both abilities. So how can we make this kind of realistic, right? Engineering futurism, where we can imagine crazy futures or wonderful futures for the Earth, for design, for the territory, which are completely realizable, which are computable, which are buildable. For these collaborations, how do we make this into kind of research program of a center? So that will be my kind of big futuristic goal.
Oh, but here it is. What struck me was an old-fashioned sense of modernity that came out of all these talks. That it's the culture of geopolitics at a tipping point. This tipping point is going to change almost month by month, I have a suspicion, at least culturally speaking. The rest of it is all prepared. So then you think for a minute, okay, that means there has to be a lot of changeability within the system that's set up. The idea of new forms, at least coming out of research. What would a new form of research be for this particular tipping point? It may never even get a name, but you have the right to name it, of course, if you'd like, this tipping point. And then a new sense even of what agency should exist within forms like this in a university world. We know we can look at these things, but the point is what agency at this very unique moment, particularly when the geopolitics are going to be shifting, who knows? Look what the last year brought. Can we even guess what the next 12 months will bring? The barometric possibilities are incredible. So it should be built into the system. So the discourse really evolves responsive forms. And I think you have a possibility to do it. I felt that this weekend. It seemed like everyone here is very interested to see what these could be. And everyone seems to be powerfully realistic in a relatively playful way. So that's a good sign.
So I think this global group of thinkers, that's why I don't like the tank, I like the anti-tank. I like the blowing it open to the whole world, and that's of course what the technology now allows for. And we've done this at Cal too in a number of other things. Digital cinema, we have, people in Prague sending uncompressed 4K digital cinema to the thing here while we're interacting with people in Japan. So we have at this place the capability we've built over 10 years to do that. We ought to be, your center would be perfectly set up to take advantage of that and to have a more global discussion. Even, I know, Benjamin, you've talked about having multiple sites, having synchronous meetings and then interacting through these media and driving the media, actually, and everything from tweeting and sort of low bandwidth up through full high definition video and so forth. But I have to say this whole global change thing is going to completely dominate us. I mean, at the same time that you're bringing this vast set of people, I mean, so many of these Near East things are like in Syria, it's not the middle class. It's the dispossessed, it's the people that are young, without jobs, without hope, that are driving this. And now imagine this whole world coming up, and because of the technology, they're being heard for the first time ever. And so that's going to accelerate. And so the world's going to disintegrate in the geopolitics that we knew very quickly, I think. And we've run out of places to invade. I mean, we just don't have the muscle and the strength. Yeah, I mean, it's like the world's going to start dissolving much faster than we can send in warships, or whatever. So that's going to be pretty interesting. But this global change thing that's driving, one of the things that I've thought about is people don't care about the average temperature of the Earth. That's a completely abstract concept. They care about what's happening in their backyard, what's happening in their region. And we're set up here to look at Southern California in a very unique situation where you have the border, you have rich, poor, desert, mountain, seacoast, coastal zone, urban areas. And so it's like you have a microcosm of the world here. And really instrumenting that socially as well as in terms of what we actually have, the best environmental networks anywhere on the planet right here. If we could then sort of imagine other places doing the same, and then having this sort of combined journey into the future in which we're sharing back and forth. And in other words, think of this as a decadal happening. I'm in the 60s person, so whatever, all right? I mean, but a shared experience, let's put it that way, in which we're people taking technologies that are learning here and applying them elsewhere, taking social processes. And I think setting out a goal like that, without what it's going to do, forget the governments, they're not going to be what's going to change things at all. They're just going to be inertia, as Ricardo so aptly said, forget them. And just go straight to the people. I mean, it's the cities right now where the action is. The smaller the unit, the more you're seeing collective global action to move things forward. And I think that a group like this has an opportunity on a global basis, while acting locally, but connecting globally, to do something that, you know, we've really never seen before.
So the one thing that I keep coming back to for the last 2 days is this tension between optimism and pessimism and how to navigate that. And I think that's a really key problem. And I appreciated Naomi's points about, you know, the value at some points of being pessimistic and conveying that. But you can't stay there, obviously. And I really like Lev's call for these kind of, you know, practical how to go forward. But I do think it's not all about high tech. And I really appreciated Ricardo's bringing out these shoes today. And, you know, it's a wake-up call that that this isn't necessarily the total answer to be in these, you know, high-tech facilities developed, because that's, you know, that's one piece of it, but certainly not how we have to envision this a radical rethinking, you know, of geo-governance and geopolitics.
Yeah, the fact that people shouting on their rooftops is now one of the primary modes of communication for political change in the Arab-speaking world, I think speaks to the fact that not everything is technical.
I just want to make 2 observations about what kind of knowledge practice one might be attempting to create. And the first is a bit specifically to do with the fact that I'm a humanist, and that's got to do with changing the both temporal and spatial scale that we've operated on. I now think the key discipline in the humanities is actually archaeology, like that's the one to grasp. And it will not get you into geological time, but to at least think 300,000 years seems a relevant scale. And the other scale is the relation between the molecular and the global. So while I find the subatomic sort of interesting, it's really, you know, not the tactically necessary scale. It's how does the molecular interact with the global would be the other scale. That for humanists is hard to grapple with because we're not really trained to deal with either of those extremes. But it seems to me that's the piece that needs work. So there was a thing called radical anti-humanism, was a movement of the late 20th century. It never got radical enough because it never got to either of those scales, and it needs to be pushed a lot further. The second observation goes a little bit off something Lev was talking about, that there are actually precedents for a different mode of organising knowledge that's what I would call agenda-driven, where you don't ignore the disciplines. They're important because they validate, you know, the quality of what people do, but you need to apply them to specific problems. And that happens in wartime. And I think the interesting precedent for me is not the American scientific establishment during the war, but the British one, which was much, much more open and flexible. We've got people like Haldane figuring out what the bends is by doing experiments on his own body, or Bernal figuring out how to get a tank up a Normandy beach by collecting postcards, by reading medieval romances and sending commandos out to get soil samples, and of course doing some basic physics about it weighs this much and so on. Now that's not science, but it's all based on, it's grounded in certain kinds of knowledge that's a real practice. So how do you create those conditions when you don't have an immediate sense of emergency, which is I think Larry's thing. There really is one, but it doesn't feel as imminent. You know, you can get people to do this in wartime because people think it's going to be over. They can be mobilised to do these things. So it's a little bit, that's I think the kind of knowledge, and it's the British example is interesting to me. But how do you create the sense that this is a kind of practice? And the one thing I'd just say about how Ben's framed the whole project, which is fabulous to put the 3 things together, I'm just sceptical that the term politics means what we think it does anymore. And as you know, I'm interested in power, in conflict, in praxis, but I just don't know that the polis is the classical reference point that will help us with that, and that's the bit that I would maybe want to rethink. But to put design and the geo together with something that covers those 3 things seems to me to bootstrap the kinds of knowledge practice one would want. And as a humanist, I just hope I get to still participate in that and that anything we might have ever studied is worth something. But yeah, given what Larry was showing, I was kind of watching the presentation going, yes, it's a really good version of something I've seen, you know, quite a few times. And it's like, holy crap, he's now talking about cigarette smoking and behaviours, and I got a whole new perspective on the problem, which would then give you reason to believe that one needs to rethink that political space. So thank you for that.
All right, now I have the talking stick. One thing that kept coming up, I think, was this notion of simulation, and whether that simulation is coming through postcards and soil samples, or it's coming through what Casey was talking about in terms of procedural literacy and behaviors, or different modes of modeling and literacy in ways of modeling, whether that takes place in radical theater in the street, and whether it takes place across technologies. I think there are important things to look at. I do wonder, for the purposes of a center and a university campus, the extent to which that begins to affect curriculum, which is kind of an offline discussion that's bounced around a little bit here, how it changes collaborations, and how it could ultimately change the output of what we do in a scholarly space or not, so that the output is not not only what a lab could produce, but could be games, or could be art, or could be something that we don't yet have, that it isn't just what social media brings us, but maybe it's what analog media brings us as well.
Thanks. I was really inspired by this morning to the pairing of the big picture science with directly after the sort of the big picture narrative or storytelling, and I wonder if that's a direction to pair the two and to actually work on either short-term or long-term hard science fiction or social fictions. And then also Larry's comment of being really impressed by the exhibition at the MoMA. It seems like taking big picture science with ways of telling a narrative around it and then putting that into those kinds of communications could be a really good, like one of the tasks of the system.
Just very briefly about the shoes, right? So, well, you know, we look very low tech, but we're very high tech because it's basically plastic, right? It's kind of industrial material which was invented in some kind of lab, like LIT2, 60 years ago, right? So is the metal cities where we. So I think when I was talking about this problem, right, of how to make the exceptions which we all love when people from different disciplines come together to a norm, I wasn't really talking about labs. I was just talking about people who like numbers and who can basically calculate, you know, like a fit curve between data points, putting them together with people who think of numbers more poetically. So it's not necessarily about people who have different skills, just in making these exceptional collaborations almost like a norm, right?
But I'm not sure that the consensus that comes out of those 2 days is about anything to do with lower or higher or no tech. You know, we heard about return to the village, and we heard about fast forward into the singularity. We heard various bets about cyber infrastructure and what it can do for us, and about what you know, the lowest mode of, you know, found objects that are not fabricated can do. But it seems that this is a little bit my Maoist self-interrogation, that, you know, we're still, you know, Norman said, you know, we all bring these good intentions to a dialogue across disciplines. That might actually be the ultimate weakness. I'm looking back at all of the solutions that didn't take, like, you know, why did the phrase Spaceship Earth not convince people to buy into a certain kind of mentality, or you know, the very high-tech modes of designing orbital or suborbital, you know, stations where humans could live when Earth becomes unlivable. Why doesn't that take hold? You know, they fire the imagination to a certain point, and then it doesn't work. You know, maybe Spaceship Earth, which nobody brought here. You know, I was expecting Ben maybe to show some of the slides that he had only 4 days ago or so put into his Twitter feed of NASA, you know, space stations. why did that fail? Maybe it's because we're so anthropocentric, that we want to think of Earth as, the 0 point of our coordinates, and we don't want to think of it as a spaceship. And we're not really in this with people on a different social graph. I think I was really struck by, the animation that shows how you cluster with people who are alike. And we're clearly clustered with people who are alike. There are 3 women on stage, but we're overwhelmingly white, and overwhelmingly academics with several degrees, and overwhelmingly here with good intentions. That's all great. That's good. That's a good starting point. But
mine are evil, actually.
Yours are evil. I was going to out you. And you were wearing a gamer theory hat when you tweeted that you want to develop a game called the Great Climate Challenge. Great Climate Adventure.
Let's call it that. Yeah.
Climate Adventure. And I think some evil intentions are always in the mix. But maybe what's really needed is something that brings all of these low or high tech things together in a way that doesn't oppose them to each other. Taking off of Kelly's and Casey's and Norman's observations of how these things travel across panels. These are all imagined communities, imaginary communities, and they have to kind of scale up rather than splinter. And most of the inventions that are relatively high tech that we have seen used here actually go in the opposite direction. They go in the direction of splintering. So Larry's correct to point out that Southern California is a microcosm, but it's also very good at sorting. It's sorting us into little bins that don't communicate very well. So the idea that Ed brought up of a system seems to be crucial, a system that can circulate ideas across these various sorted places.
Is this a live mic?
Yeah,
You brought it back to life?
Yeah.
Oh. I want to start with something that Kelly said about optimism. Certainly, it may not have come out in my talk, but I'm actually infinitely capable of making pessimistic assessments. I can tell you what any course of action will do with high probability to cause existential disaster, including not doing anything. So this puts me in kind of has always put me in kind of a bind. During the 1950s, there was science fiction about miraculous technical fixes. And I would say by the 1990s, I was very dubious. And any time that something good would happen, like the Arab Spring, I could visualize 12 ways that it could go wrong. On the other hand, the last 10 years, there really have been several events that might have been rejected by John W. Campbell, the greatest science fiction editor of all time, if they had been submitted to his magazine, Astounding Science Fiction. And one of them is the notion that in 5 or 6 years from essentially zero, I think more than half the human beings in the world would have cell phones. When one considers the infrastructure that's necessary to do that, and the investment, and the fact that it went through with essentially no global plan whatsoever, but the imagination and the knowledge of people who knew that they wanted something that would empower them in a way that was expected of the PC, but not so much of the telephone. That actually has made me have hope for things like what Larry was talking about with the Arab Spring. I think one thing that would be sort of interesting to do in connection with, you were talking about Spaceship Earth and why it hasn't taken off. The same exercise would probably be simpler, but it might be equally interesting and might give some inspiration for the more important question about Spaceship Earth, is to look at various technologies that have betrayed their exponential trends. And when I was a kid, there were exponential trends on maximum velocity that people could move at. And it perfectly, quote, predicted, unquote, the Apollo landing. It has, if it had continued, we'd have an expedition that'd be landing at the planets of Alpha Centauri probably in 2004. So what went wrong? And I think looking at what went wrong with those technological things, and there's actually a lot of social reasons what went wrong, but looking at that actually might provide some inspiration about the things that are more existentially threatful.
Well, just to build quickly off of what we were just talking about, it also appears, and I could sense it in all the talks here, that there's a real dialectical tension that we're all noticing that has always existed but seems to be unique to this moment. The intense stillness in the United States, and at the same time a kind of blowback. If you look at the politics in Wisconsin last week, it's pretty fascinating. I mean, they're going to possibly fire their government. that's pretty good. I'm sort of surprised, right? No support, right? They're firing the government. Not bad. See, it's the United States. It's what we've got, right? But so this entire geopolitical exercise is happening in the midst of this strange tension, because I don't want to be too 60s about it, but there is some kind of blowback here also, and the blowback's important. But the extreme stillness is really, really strange, and obviously is geopolitically determined. That's going to be part of everything that gets done here. So that
well, I was going to touch on, I think, what, in terms of the question of design of the future in the past, that is, what went wrong or didn't go right. I was reading an essay on how the Apollo astronaut suit was designed. And of course, all these engineers, these high-tech folk were developing all sorts of things, and they failed and failed. And finally, they went to a bra company. And the women who create the bras and, sew them together basically then developed the Apollo mission spacesuits in terms of their layering, their mobility. And I suppose the failure of imagining the future being resolved by a certain segment of community. So that's who you would go to for solution. And as opposed to this other quadrant, that is an engineering problem can't possibly, if you go to the government or, I don't know, the head of your company, we're going to go to the women who sew the bras together, because I think they'll actually accomplish it, and they're the ones who won the competition. So that there is this kind of fiber of the future that fails because it doesn't locate what are the zones of invention, because they're categorized as not the space to engineer the future. So perhaps as we look at the failures of an imagined future, is to look at those moments when there is a kind of transversal side-loading of the unexpected community of knowledge that we don't put in the radar of knowledge. And so perhaps the failures of the imagined future are the lack of those moments happening.
Mike in.
Yeah. Why don't we turn over the audience?
Sure.
Yeah.
Should work. Have another one.
2 mics. Hello. Oh, yes. Okay. Ricardo says bras. That's my cue. Thank you all for all of your brilliant comments and really interesting panels. I was only able to catch a couple of them, unfortunately. But what this makes me think of is how teaching here at UCSD in the Culture, Art, and Technology program, I feel this kind of guilt between telling students that everything is changing around them and they better pay attention, and feeling that actually the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So the question that I've been really plagued with in thinking about computational governments and designing geopolitics is, how can we use something like code to address problems that remain unspoken and unspeakable and undefined, right? So code is so good at defining things. But we live in, so in particular, I'm thinking, for example, about something like sexual violence and rape, right? Somebody mentioned rape. And so we live in this world where it seems like everybody would agree that rape is a bad thing, but still it persists that 1 in 4 women are victims of sexual violence, right? Or if we think about like other levels of sexual violence, probably every woman is a victim of some level of sexual violence, right? So how do we use code to solve problems like this, which apparently we can't talk about, apparently don't exist, right? And I think about how in the last discussion we were talking about how questions of pedagogy and like how do we get students interested in code and programming often still fall around lines of race, class, gender, and ability. The question of who's invited, who's important, who's comfortable in the situations we're creating, and not just who are we designing for, but who's designing the systems, right? And we also talked in the last panel, there was this good point about how Web 2.0 is still a kind of enclosure, right? And if we imagine the radical change that might have been helped a little bit by people in Egypt and in the Arab world using Twitter, they're still using a system that was designed by people in the US, right? Probably people in San Francisco. And there's this reason they know about Twitter, right? It's probably because of this persistent centralization of the media. And what if they were using systems that they designed? How would they look different than Twitter? Okay, that was a long question. It's for all the panelists.
Why, thank you. I wonder the extent to which they are using systems of their own design, and it's not Twitter, whether it's standing on the rooftops, as Liz put it, or whether it's novel flash mob use without ever being told, oh, look, flash mobs exist and it's 2003 and isn't this fun? Or simple ways of emergent cell phone behavior. You can think of the whole flashing, beeping thing that people started using phones for to subvert phone charges in sub-Saharan Africa and probably everywhere else. I mean, everybody who's got a mom somewhere and needed to call them when they got home did the one ring. And so I think the question there is how you foster the moves of things like that, or of contingent media. In Pakistan during some of the riots in 2007, the cell phone network had been shut down, and people started using FM radio to communicate. One of the reasons they started doing that is because although you can't have news, you can call in. You can call in, and you can have weather and traffic reports. And so every 5 minutes they'd break in with weather and traffic to say there's everything shut down in a certain part of Karachi, which meant there's shootings going on. Don't go there until later this evening. But I think one of the things to do might be to map those contingent flows of media and those possibilities. And maybe it isn't so much a matter of code, but anti-code, or circumnavigating it, or going under it.
I mean, I mean, in the Philippines, and let's remember, popular revolt didn't start in 2011, right? It's constant. It's a constant, But in the Philippines, it was sending jokes over GSM phones via text messaging, which at the time was free. Because of GSM works differently to the CDMA phones, and it's a separate system, and no one thought to meter it, and so on. But my question back was is Twitter actually American? Do we know who the engineers even were that built the damn thing? Are they here on H-1B visas from all over the freaking planet? I just don't know that it's necessarily... They're obviously cause and peripheries to power, but they don't map onto spaces and cultures the way they used to, and it's actually getting to that level of complexity, I think, be kind of interesting, which does not negate the question at all. Although, obviously, the obvious answer to the question is if Twitter was designed in the Arab world, the screen would read from right to left rather than left to right, and people wouldn't have to reverse engineer their language to fit into it. But, there we go.
I was thinking about Ricardo's bra sewers and how we could possibly design a computer program that would get people to consult them. And I think the problem is that a lot of the people who design systems either go to the kind of majoritarian sort of like or unlike ideas about how we compute our participation in governance. Or we have this sort of targeted marketing model to the autonomous individual. And I think that my concern often about design and geopolitics and computing tends to be that these paradigms are the ones that are supposed to represent democracy 2.0 and our fabulous participatory culture. And so I don't know the answer to that problem. I only know actually how to do deliberation face-to-face. And, you know, or now with Skype, I'm able to do it that way too.
Well, I'm not sure if I can say it.
On the bottom.
1, 2, good. So push the button. I was going to say, in terms of your relationship to the question of sexual violence and, you know, other questions of global design. I was in Spain on the day at Reina Sofia working, on the day Antorcha blew up, right, which was their 9/11. And I was at working with a group of women at a house for abused women to escape their condition. And there was a group of activistas who were developing SMS systems so that the women could send messages of emergency if their violent partner was approaching the house, so they could then gather and create kind of a bodily force field of community, right? And it was part of a project called de-abstracting hacktivism, you know, that sort of thing. But what happened was the women were testing it when the Antorcha blew up, right? And what they accidentally began to discover was that the messaging got fucked up, and they were starting to get messages from other communities who were mentioning that the government in power was trying to say it was the Basque who had done it and not Al-Qaeda, because it would have thrown off their political regime. And the vote was coming up 2 days later, as in the Spanish Revolution that's happening now, right? And what happened was this local group of women then began using the text message to talk to the activistas who were working on this, right? So suddenly in Catalonia, other places started people saying it's not the Basque, right? It's Al-Qaeda, and don't believe the government. They're just trying to frame the situation towards the vote of their power. And basically the day before the vote, there was a day of silence and meditation in Spain. You're not supposed to have ads, you're just supposed to be at home and think about your vote, right? Well, what these women did was they said, no, we're going to go out silently in front of the right-wing government, and we're going to hold up our hands and our cell phones, and basically it's mentirosos, 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 right? Liars, liars, liars. And this happened very quickly, and they gathered, but it was these women who had been focusing on one level of abuse, suddenly shifting that condition of the languages that, you know, of the scales of symbolic violence versus their real violence, and they connected it together. And what was interesting was that I would walk down that part of Madrid, and I would see because we had been working with them, and they would walk by and they would just hold up the cell phone and then hold up their hand, right? Again, communicating this moment. So what I took from that is that perhaps global design and the way that is being spoken here of, that is the polis and the cosmopolitan and the scales of the world, is that rather than global and glocal and it should be lobal. That is, that design comes from small groups enacting the accidents on occasion of technology that redesigns them to deal with another scale. So that often I think to think about that is then to make it common, right? This thing of take a lobal instance of geo-design and then make it this notion of commonism, right, and participate it as enactment rather than the larger scale of a local moving into the position of trying to design that local, right? So.
So we have one more comment, or Ed, and let's do Lev, and then Ed. I'm going to give you the last word. I want to, and then.
Well, so I'd like to, coming when Ben and me and others have to get stuff there, so I'm still trying to tease out what the next 10 to. Come on, sorry. Maybe if I play with it, maybe if I misuse it. Yeah, okay. So my understanding, I mean, you guys tell me if it's correct. My understanding is that in 2000s, right, design became very hot and very fashionable. Well, on the one hand, because it became a way to kind of sell commodities to the new globalized world, but also because the companies, the governments in some cases, right, the average institutions realized that designers had something how people didn't have, right? They had certain methodologies, rapid prototyping, et cetera, right? So design was adopted as a kind of new way to do business, as a new way to think about things, right? But so when I thought about Ben Center, I thought this is simply kind of scaling it up, right? So before we thought of, let's say, a chair design problem, in 2000s we start thinking about, I don't know, like a car or structure of a company's design, right? Or let's say school in the case of RISD, right? As a design program when John Maeda came to RISD and we said, Mr. Maeda, you never run a school, you never were a school administrator, how are you going to run RISD? He said, well, I'm just going to think of RISD design problem, right? And the next step up would be to think of California, right? Or as a world as a design problem. But what I'm wondering is, let's say focus on California, right? So what does it actually practically, right? What does it practically mean to say, let's think of California as a design problem, as opposed to, let's think of California as engineering problem, or as a computational problem, or as an economic problem, right? So I wonder if Ben or others may have some practical examples, right? What does it actually mean, right? So what does it mean to bring design thinking, right, on the kind of geo scale? So I think we have lots and lots of conversations across it, but I'm actually looking for some very kind of practical, how to, like, what kind of projects can be done along these lines. I mean, Ben is doing some, but I assume you're also looking for some kind of additional sort of projects, additional directions, additional ways in which these two lines can be connected.
Yeah, it's a far longer answer than I can provide.
That's a question, yeah.
I think it's
or, for example, to say California design problem versus California's engineering problem, or California's architecture problem, for example.
We have time to hand it to the front side, so I'm going to...
Maybe going back to John Brunner's novel Shockwave Rider from the early 70s, where he imagines California, part of the design problem of California being the United States recovering from a Bay quake that destroys San Francisco. So he looks at the national and global consequences of the loss of a city like San Francisco, which presumably is just completely annihilated. And he looks at the near loss of the United States and California being the site where survivors go to essentially recover. There's a kind of a national scale psychic recovery program in California and paid avoidance areas where you're paid not to use the internet because if you don't consume those resources, you won't add strain to the national network, to all of the national support systems. And so the way that he's imagining California's design problem is to think about risk and play out a scenario where the scale of a region and the design problem of the region connect back to a possible risk scenario. So I think that to me, from what I know about what you've been doing around California's design problem, that's one way of doing it that could connect back to some of the points that Larry raised. I wanted to pick up on the issue of coding that the audience member, Micah, had brought up. I think the violence issue has been addressed, but the coding issue is interesting to me because if you look at code, you can either look at what the code explicitly controls or expresses, or you can look at the second and third order systems around the code. All of the things that happen as a byproduct of or that lead to the code. And I think that that maybe is another way of thinking about control systems and code. That's one of the reasons why I included, stills of studies on the human microbiome in my talk, because I wanted to make it really clear. People are swapping gut flora, and they are benefiting from swapping gut flora. And that way of thinking the extended body is another way of using code not to look at just a body that moves as a single point agent through a subway system, but to look at the halo of other relations that body builds around itself and is constantly indexing. And I think that desire and violence and local agency and global agency and communication systems all play around that kind of halo of connections. Mm-hmm. So that would be one way that I would try to constantly rethink code. I mean, I've had a lot of dialogues with architects who are using code a lot, multi-agent systems a lot, not just to simulate the movement of people in cities, although they do that, but also to generate the form of buildings and the form of urban arrangements. And usually there's a poverty of thinking around how code is then translated into those forms. But increasingly it's becoming much more sophisticated. So that's one kind of response there. And then just finally, the issue of the connection of the lab out into a community. I know Benjamin is aware of this example and probably many other people here, but one of the connections that the UN Global Pulse Project is engaged with is plugging into the Question Box project. And for those of you who don't know it, it's literally just a box. You walk up to it in a place where you don't have cell phone coverage in a developing nation, and you press the button and you say, I really don't know what the weather's going to be like for the next 2 weeks, or I need to know how to get fertilizer into my crops, or I need to know how to get arsenic out of my water. And at the other end of the line, someone like you or me is looking that up, and a few minutes later in the local language answers the question. And if the question's answered, you press the other button and you walk away. So that has direct response kind of conditions on the ground, but what UN Global Pulse is doing is they're starting to monitor those questions just like the Google flu tracking. Now, it seems like it's very few sample points, but if you can scale that up, and it doesn't seem like it's a big lift to scale that kind of project up, then all of a sudden you can get a really incredible cohort and a lot more sample points. And that kind of scalability could be a really interesting project in relationship to this anti-think tank. So, I mean, just one idea to offer, I see that as a kind of an infrastructural, institutional.
Yeah. Yeah, we have Robert Kirkpatrick from UN Global Plus. We were met a couple of weeks ago in New York, and he's actually coming out here next month. And the guy who did that project. Let me just. I want to give everybody a chance to get out of here at a reasonable hour.
I also just want to say that I think we really owe Benjamin a round of applause, and that.
Thank you. Let me. Okay, so there's no way in which I can possibly try to put these threads together in any sort of way, so I'm not even going to sort of try with this as well. Other than to say is that for me, and I think for the way this was set up and they mentioned, this was as a kind of as initiation and try to catalyze something that we'll work on further. And this conversation here has been enormously helpful in terms of understanding, I think, some of the better ways in which we can calibrate that. So this is the beginning of a conversation, to which all of you will continue to be a part of, continue to be involved. Larry and I were talking over the break about how CalIT can be a kind of catalyst and a platform for these kinds of things as well, and to make use of it in that way, and to sort of allow it to function as a center within this decentered network in ways in which we can use it, and that's exactly what we're going to do. I think that just to sort of say a couple quick things to Lev's point, and maybe also as a way to land this in a different way. One of the things that's also been brought up again is this idea of the utopia, and the idea of is one way in which we have at least certain, not only modernity but other sorts of pre-modern and other sorts of traditions have tried to think about the totality of the world as something that could be composed and remade in the image of something more ideal. And the problem with, in architecture in the 20th century, there was something called total design, which is where all of this was done by a particular kind of author. And, in many different ways, that the 20th century was defined by the catastrophe of various utopian projects that in one way or another, because of the totality of their ambition, produced forms of violence that were otherwise inconceivable. I happen to be one that doesn't think that means that the utopian energy is something that should be resisted or...
It's actually an entirely questionable narrative.
It's an entirely questionable narrative, and yet it's...
Actually, it's the other way around. You have failed revolutions and utopias written after them.
I think we're on the same page with this as well. Nevertheless, the question of the question of this sort of society, I think one we're getting is that there's a kind of procedural, is that what Casey called the kind of, I don't know, what was the procedural literacy, but it really is a kind of procedurality that, code is a generative system and it proceeds bottom up. It actually sets something in action that can aggregate and can take on form, and what Manuel was talking about, these sorts of kind of assemblage that can actually have a kind of durability and institutionality. The question, I think, is how it is that these sorts of bottom-up aggregations can ultimately take on the force, if not become law and become institutions in their own right, but can actually take on the force of law, and that designation can happen at a much larger scale. So the question, and perhaps in a certain sort of paradoxically, is how is it possible to think about total design from the bottom up? And this is the way, and I think where we're sort of at with this as well. So anyway, we'll be in touch with each of you individually and as a group. I'm enormously grateful and thankful for your time and your energy and your participation here. I also want to thank Hector's and his AV staff here and the CalIT2 staff for their amazing job in making this whole thing happen totally seamlessly, for Pratik for stepping up, and also to Daniel Wren and Tar Zebel, the co-organizers of the conference, without whom this wouldn't have happened. So thank you.